The crowd in the Colosseum had seen everything. They had watched men fight lions barehanded. They had watched naval battles staged in the flooded arena. They had watched condemned criminals fed to exotic animals imported from the farthest corners of the empire. They had watched the best gladiators in the Roman world face each other in duels that combined athletic perfection with the specific terror of actual death. They thought they had seen everything, and then the emperor walked in, not to watch, to fight. He wore the armor of a secutor, one of the standard gladiatorial classes, heavy and hot and designed for a specific kind of combat. He carried the weapons of the arena, not ceremonial replicas, but actual fighting equipment, and he walked to the center of the sand floor of the greatest amphitheater ever built, and he looked out at the crowd that had come to watch him. Some of them cheered, some of them went very quiet. All of them understood that something was happening that had never happened before. The man in the armor was Marcus Aurelius, Commodus and Emperor of Rome, ruler of 60 million people, master of the greatest empire in the Western world. And he had decided that being emperor was not enough. He wanted to be a god. He wanted to be a gladiator. He wanted to be Hercules, and the Rome that had given the world Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the Stoic ruler who wrote his meditations on campaign, was now watching his son sweat in the sand with a sword in his hand and no intention of stopping. This is the story of how that happened, and why it matters far more than the gladiatorial games suggest. If you are new here, this channel exists to tell history the way it deserves to be told, with every detail, without shortcuts, at the pace the story requires. If you have been here before, you know what we do, and you know that by the end you will understand Commodus in a way that no film and no textbook has ever quite managed. Take a breath. The modern world can wait. We are going back to Rome. The Rome that Commodus was born into in 161 AD was the Rome of the High Empire. The Rome that historians have called one of the most prosperous and well-governed periods in human history. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was already emperor and already showing the qualities that would make him the most admired of all the Caesars. A man who genuinely tried to govern according to the Stoic philosophy he practiced in private, who wrote his philosophical reflections in Greek, in a private journal that was never intended for publication, and that has survived as one of the most remarkable personal documents in the history of Western thought. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which is what that journal would eventually be called, is a text of extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary discipline. It shows a man in constant conversation with himself about how to be better, how to govern more justly, how to face suffering without complaint, how to maintain equanimity in the face of everything that power and responsibility and human frailty could produce. It is not a political manifesto or a philosophical treatise, but a private record of a man trying every day to live up to his own understanding of the good. To be the son of this man was to be born into an atmosphere of very high expectations and very specific ideals. And Commodus was born into it as the first emperor's son, born while his father was already emperor since Domitian, a century earlier. The emphasis on this fact in the ancient sources reflects how it was understood at the time. The dynasty that had managed succession through adoption of the best available candidate for 4 generations was now producing a biological heir. And the question of whether biological inheritance would produce a ruler of comparable quality to the men who had been chosen for the role was one that the educated class of Rome asked with real anxiety. The answer they received over the following decades was not what they had hoped. But before we understand what Commodus became, we have to understand what he was. And that requires understanding the childhood that shaped him, which was a childhood unlike any other in the Roman world. He was born on the 31st of August in 161 AD, one of twins, his twin brother dying in infancy, at a villa near Lanuvium, southeast of Rome, and from the beginning his life was conducted in public in a way that no child's life should be. He was given the title Caesar at the age of 5, made co-emperor at the age of 16, and the entire trajectory of his childhood was defined by the preparation for a role that would make him the most powerful person in the world. Marcus Aurelius was not a neglectful father, the sources suggest. A man who was genuinely attentive to his son's education and who tried to provide the best possible preparation for imperial rule. The tutors appointed to educate the young Commodus were among the most distinguished available, including figures who had connections to the highest intellectual circles of the period. The education was designed to produce a philosopher-emperor in the mold of Marcus himself, versed in rhetoric and philosophy and the practical arts of governance. Something went wrong. The sources all agree on this, though they disagree on exactly what and when. Some suggest that the problem was Commodus's natural temperament, that he was simply not suited to the contemplative discipline that Stoic philosophy required and that his father embodied. Some suggest that the problem was the education itself, that the tutors were inadequate, or that they indulged the imperial child in ways that Marcus's own more rigorous upbringing would not have permitted. Some suggest that the problem was the court environment itself, the constant presence of flatterers and people who needed things from the emperor's son. Marcus himself was aware of the problem. The Meditations contain passages that historians have read as oblique acknowledgments that his son was not turning out as he had hoped, passages about the importance of not being corrupted by the court, about the difficulty of maintaining virtue in an environment of power, about the failure of education to reliably produce the character it aims at. These passages may not refer to Commodus specifically, but they were written by a man watching his son develop in a direction that his philosophy found troubling. The campaign years on the Danube frontier, where Marcus spent much of the 170s fighting the Marcomanni and the Quadi and the other Germanic peoples pressing against the empire's northern border, took the emperor away from Rome for extended periods and correspondingly reduced his direct influence on his son's development. Commodus was brought to the front in 172, still a child, and given the title Germanicus as part of the ceremonial martial education that imperial sons received. But the actual experience of campaign life seems to have impressed him in ways that were not entirely what Marcus had intended. The military culture of the campaign, the physical toughness, the direct exercise of power, the adulation of soldiers who responded to a strong leader with straightforward and satisfying loyalty, seems to have appealed to Commodus in ways that the philosophical discussions of the imperial study did not. This is not unusual. Military environments have always appealed to people who find the uncertainties and ambiguities of political and intellectual life less satisfying than the clarity of physical achievement. But for a future emperor of the Roman world, it was a tendency that needed to be balanced by the other qualities required for governance, and the balance was not achieved. Marcus Aurelius died on the 17th of March in 180 AD at Sirmium or Vindobona. The sources disagree on the exact location. During the Danubian campaign, he had been ill for some time, possibly with the plague that had been recurring throughout the empire since the 160s, possibly with some other condition. And he was 60 years old for his era, worn by decades of responsibility and campaigning and philosophical struggle. He died as he had lived, composedly. His final recorded words, a stoic farewell to the things of this world. Commodus was with the army at the time, and he became emperor immediately, at 19 years old. and his first major decision was to end the Danubian War that his father had been fighting, and to return to Rome. This decision was controversial then, and has been debated by historians ever since. Marcus had been pursuing a policy of extending the Danube frontier, possibly with the long-term goal of incorporating the Transdanubian territories into the empire, and Commodus's peace was a reversal of this policy. The ancient sources, hostile to Commodus, as they almost uniformly are, present this decision as evidence of weakness or laziness, as the preference of a young man who wanted to go back to Rome over the hard work of completing his father's military campaign. Modern historians have been somewhat more sympathetic, noting that the peace terms Commodus obtained were not dishonorable, and that the campaign had been costly, and that the strategic case for extending the frontier beyond the Danube was not as clear as the hostile sources suggest. What is clear is that the decision to leave the Danube and return to Rome established an early pattern in Commodus's reign, the pattern of prioritizing his personal preferences over the political and military expectations that the position of emperor carried, and this pattern would define and ultimately destroy his reign. The Rome that Commodus returned to in 180 AD was ready to celebrate him. The population was tired of war, tired of plague, tired of the austerity that Marcus's philosophical temperament had imposed on the court. Commodus was young and handsome and willing to provide the spectacular entertainment that the Roman people craved. He staged games of extraordinary extravagance. He was generous with distributions of money and food. He was accessible in ways that Marcus's more reserved temperament had not allowed. For several years, the reign was not obviously disastrous. The empire was governed by capable officials. The machinery of administration continued to function. The frontiers were maintained. The day-to-day work of running the world's largest empire went on without obvious disruption. Commodus was emperor in name and in the symbolic functions of the role, but the actual work of governance was performed by people around him, whose competence compensated for his disengagement. The crisis that would define his reign differently arrived in 182 AD, 2 years after his accession, in the form of a genuine assassination attempt. His sister Lucilla, who had been empress as the wife of Lucius Verus before that co-emperor's death, and who found the diminished status of emperor's sister compared to empress intolerably humiliating, organized a conspiracy with several senators to kill Commodus. The attempt was made in the passageway of the Colosseum. The conspirators chose the theatrical logic of killing the emperor at the games. A young man named Quintianus was chosen to do the actual killing. He approached Commodus with a drawn sword, and according to the ancient sources, shouted something along the lines of "The Senate sends you this," before plunging the weapon toward the emperor. The specific words vary in different sources, but the emphasis on the Senate sending the message was a deliberate political statement designed to implicate the senatorial class in the assassination attempt. Quintianus was seized before he could complete the act. The attempt failed. Commodus was physically unharmed, and the political consequences of the failure were severe and lasting. Lucilla was exiled and later executed. The co-conspirators were killed, and Commodus emerged from the experience with a specific and permanent suspicion of the Senate that would shape the rest of his reign in ways that made the history of the period increasingly dark. The suspicion was not entirely irrational. Quintianus's words had named the Senate, and while the specific senators involved in the conspiracy were a small group whose motivations were personal as much as political, the fact that the assassination had been organized at all, and organized using the language of senatorial authority, gave Commodus genuine reason to view the aristocratic class as a potential source of existential threat. What he did with this suspicion was the problem. he began placing increasing reliance on people outside the traditional senatorial class, on freedmen and equestrians and personal favorites, who had no independent political base and whose entire position depended on his favor. The most important of these figures was Soterus, a freedman from Bithynia, who had become the emperor's chamberlain and who exercised enormous informal influence in the early years of the reign before, being killed in circumstances that the sources connect to court intrigue, and after Soterus, the increasingly powerful Gladiator, another freedman who accumulated official titles and real power in ways that the senatorial tradition found deeply offensive. Gladiator's eventual fall from power in 190 AD was one of the more dramatic episodes of the reign. A food shortage and the popular anger it generated were directed by courtiers against Gladiator rather than the emperor, and Commodus sacrificed his powerful minister to the crowd, having him executed in a scene that the ancient sources describe with a kind of grim satisfaction. The dynamics of court politics that could elevate a freedman to the second most powerful position in the empire, and then destroy him within a few years, one of the more revealing aspects of how Commodus's court functioned. The Praetorian prefects, who held the second most formally powerful position in the empire during Commodus's reign, are a series of names that illustrate the same dynamic. The capable Paternus was removed. Perennis accumulated enormous power before being delivered to the soldiers by Commodus and torn apart by them. Gladiator followed the same arc, and then Letus, who would eventually organize the assassination that ended the reign. The pattern of elevation, followed by destruction, followed by replacement, was a characteristic feature of the political culture Commodus created. The gladiatorial career that makes Commodus uniquely memorable in the long list of Roman emperors began not as a public spectacle but as a private passion. He had been interested in gladiatorial combat from childhood, which was not unusual. Many Romans of the upper classes were fascinated by gladiatorial fighting and by the culture around it. What was unusual was the intensity of the interest and the direction it took. He did not simply want to watch gladiators or to fund gladiatorial schools. He wanted to fight himself. He trained with gladiators. He practiced the specific techniques of specific gladiatorial styles. He developed real physical skill in arena combat, and he began staging private fights within the palace that his household was required to watch and to acclaim. The transition from private practice to public performance happened gradually, but it happened, and when the Emperor of Rome began fighting in the Colosseum, the reaction of the Roman world was a combination of genuine shock and carefully managed public enthusiasm. The ancient sources preserve the spectacle with the mixture of disgust and fascination that it apparently inspired in its own time. Cassius Dio, who was a senator and who witnessed some of the performances personally, describes them with a detail that suggests both genuine horror and the inability to look away that spectacular wrongness often produces. He describes Commodus fighting in the arena on numerous days, racking up a total of hundreds of fights over the course of his gladiatorial career, fighting with the equipment of a secutor in some appearances, and presenting himself in other appearances as an archer of almost supernatural accuracy. The archery performances were a specific category of Commodus's arena spectacle that are worth describing because they illuminate something important about how he understood and used the arena. He would shoot animals from a platform in the arena with arrows, ostriches, and other exotic animals that had been brought in specifically for his performances. And the accounts describe a marksmanship that was genuinely remarkable. Arrows, specially designed to create 100 ostriches killed with 100 arrows in a single session. Various animals killed with shots that the audience found impressive enough to generate genuine rather than merely commanded applause. There is something revealing about this specific form of spectacle. The archery that killed without putting the archer at risk, that demonstrated power and precision without requiring the messy business of close combat. It was impressive, but it was also safe. And the relationship between the apparently fearless gladiatorial career and the actual risk Commodus was taking in the arena is more complicated than the first impression suggests. The gladiatorial fights themselves were managed in ways that ensured the emperor's safety and victory. His opponents were armed with weapons that were inadequate for actually threatening him. His opponents were men who were very carefully not trying to hurt him. The scripts of the fights were essentially predetermined in ways that the crowd understood perfectly well, and that the ancient sources describe with barely concealed contempt. The Emperor of Rome was not fighting for his life in the Colosseum. He was performing a fantasy of gladiatorial excellence in which all the danger was theatrical rather than real. And yet, the fantasy was not entirely disconnected from genuine physical capacity. Commodus was physically impressive by the accounts of the sources. A large, strong man with genuine athletic ability, and the specific skills of gladiatorial combat that he practiced over years of training were real even if the arena performances were scripted. The distinction between genuine ability and staged invincibility is one that the Roman audience could appreciate, even as they were required to applaud both. The financial arrangements of his gladiatorial career are one of the details that the ancient sources dwell on with particular emphasis. He charged the treasury for each appearance as if he were a professional gladiator being paid for performance. The sums he charged were enormous, 1,000,000 sesterces per appearance in some accounts, and over hundreds of appearances. This added up to a significant drain on the imperial finances for performances that the treasury officials were required to fund without being permitted to question. This financial dimension of the gladiatorial career connects to the broader fiscal pressures of the reign. Commodus was not a careful administrator of the empire's finances, and the combination of his personal spending on entertainment and his disengagement from the detailed work of fiscal management created strains that would be inherited by his successors. The financial situation of the empire at the end of his reign was worse than at the beginning. Not catastrophically so, but measurably. And this deterioration was a product of both the spectacles and the broader administrative neglect that characterized the period. The Hercules identification that became the defining feature of Commodus's self-presentation is one of the most psychologically interesting aspects of the reign, and one that requires extended attention because it was not simply theatrical vanity, but a genuine and sustained attempt to redefine what the emperor was and what authority meant. Hercules was the perfect figure for this project for a specific set of reasons. He was divine, the son of Jupiter, which made the identification a claim to divine descent. He was associated with physical strength and martial achievement, which connected to Commodus's genuine physical abilities and his military. He was a universal figure, worshipped across the Mediterranean world and in the provinces, which made the identification potentially empire-wide in its resonance. And he was a figure of paradox, a divine hero who also cleaned stables and worked as a servant, which perhaps offered Commodus a way of thinking about his own position that reconciled his imperial status with his preference for the company of gladiators and slaves. The material expression of the Hercules identification was systematic and comprehensive. Commodus had statues of himself restyled as Hercules across the empire, replacing the head of existing Hercules statues with his own features in some cases, and creating new statues that combined his physical features with the standard iconography of the divine hero. The lion skin headdress, the club, the the particular posture associated with Hercules. The coins of the reign underwent a similar transformation, showing Commodus in the Herculean guise with increasing frequency as the reign progressed. The renaming campaign of 192 AD, the last year of the reign, was the most extreme expression of this identification. Commodus renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the year after himself and his various titles. He renamed the Senate the Commodian Senate, and the army the Commodian army, and the fleet the Commodian fleet. He appears to have genuinely believed that the world he governed was, in some meaningful sense, his own personal creation, and that renaming it was a legitimate act of sovereign authority, rather than an act of psychological dislocation. The ancient sources, writing after his assassination, treat this renaming with contempt that is barely concealed behind their dry recitation of the facts. Cassius Dio describes the renaming of the months with a list that makes the absurdity evident through sheer repetition. The months becoming Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculeus, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius, all Commodus's own titles and names. 12 months, renamed after a single person's self-conception. The renaming of Rome itself is the most extreme act in a list of extreme acts, and it requires some attempt at psychological understanding rather than simple condemnation. The Rome that Commodus was renaming was a city and a concept that had existed for nearly 1,000 years. That was identified with a tradition and a set of values and a collective identity that went far beyond any individual emperor. To rename it for himself was not just eccentric, but was a statement about the relationship between the emperor and the empire that fundamentally challenged the conventional understanding of that relationship. Marcus Aurelius had understood himself as the servant of the res publica, the public thing, the Roman state that existed independently of any individual who happened to be governing it. He had never confused himself with Rome, had never conflated his personal will with the authority of the imperial office, had spent his reign precisely trying to maintain the distinction between the person and the position. Commodus was doing the opposite. He was collapsing the distinction entirely, insisting that the empire was him in some literal sense that the renaming was designed to make permanent. The modern psychological frameworks that historians have applied to this behavior range from the cautious to the specific. The ancient sources were content to call him simply mad, which is a judgment rather than an explanation. More sophisticated readers have suggested narcissistic personality disorder as a framework, have pointed to the specific pattern of grandiosity and fragile self-image, and the requirement for constant external validation that the gladiatorial performances and the divine identification seem to reflect, have connected the behavior to the specific circumstances of his upbringing as a child who was simultaneously the most important person in his environment and someone whose importance was entirely derivative, who mattered because of who his father was rather than because of who he himself was. The dynamic of being Marcus Aurelius's son is worth thinking about at some length, because it may be more explanatory than any clinical framework. Marcus was genuinely great by any reasonable standard. The philosopher-emperor who wrote the Meditations and managed the empire justly and maintained the empire's borders and died on campaign is one of the most admirable figures in the entire historical record. To be his son and heir was to be measured against a standard that was essentially impossible to meet. The specific way in which Marcus was great made the comparison worse rather than better. Marcus was great in a way that was entirely internal, entirely about character and self-discipline and philosophical commitment. He was great in precisely the ways that Commodus was not, and apparently could not be. The comparison was not between one kind of greatness and another, but between greatness and its absence. And this comparison was made constantly and publicly by the senatorial class, who wrote the history and who never let the world forget what Marcus had been. One response to impossible comparison is to reject the terms of comparison entirely, to refuse the framework within which you will always fall short, and to propose an entirely different framework within which you can be supreme. This is perhaps the most psychologically coherent reading of Commodus's gladiatorial career and his Hercules identification. He could not be a philosopher-emperor. He could not be great in the way that Marcus was great. So he chose to be great in a completely different way, a way that Marcus would have found incomprehensible and that the senatorial class found offensive, but a way in which the crowd in the Colosseum would cheer for him unconditionally. The crowd in the Colosseum is an important part of this story, and one that the senatorial sources tend to minimize because the senators despised the crowd and found its enthusiasms contemptible. But the Roman crowd was a political reality. The enormous urban population of Rome that attended the games and the races and the theatrical performances was not simply a passive audience for imperial entertainment. It was a constituency whose approval mattered politically and whose disapproval could be expressed in ways that emperors needed to take seriously. Commodus was genuinely popular with the crowd in ways that the literary tradition tends to deny or minimize. The games he provided were the most spectacular in living memory. His personal appearances in the arena created an intimacy between the emperor and the entertainment-loving Roman population that no previous emperor had managed. His willingness to present himself as a gladiator, to enter the same space and perform in the same way as the men and women of the arena, who were among the most adored entertainers in Roman culture, was understood by the crowd as a form of solidarity that they responded to with genuine enthusiasm. The senatorial sources who tell us that the crowd was simply terrified into applauding need to be read critically on this point. They have obvious reasons to deny that Commodus had genuine popular support. They need him to be universally hated to justify the assassination that ended his reign and the damnatio memoria that followed. But the evidence of his popularity with the non-senatorial population is real enough to complicate the picture significantly. The man who appeared in the arena was not simply a tyrant imposing himself on a terrified city, but an entertainer who understood his audience and gave them what they wanted. The animals he killed in the arena are another category of his performances that the sources describe extensively and that deserve attention. Exotic animals from across the empire and beyond, lions and bears and hippopotami and elephants and rhinoceroses and ostriches and giraffes, were brought to Rome and killed in staged hunts that were one of the most expensive forms of arena entertainment. The cost of acquiring and transporting these animals from Africa and Asia was enormous, and the logistics involved were a significant administrative undertaking. For the Roman audience, these exotic animals were a form of imperial geography made visible. The fact that the emperor could command creatures from every corner of the world to appear in Rome for his pleasure was a demonstration of imperial reach that the crowd experienced as real and impressive. The giraffe killed in the arena was not simply a dead giraffe. It was evidence of the empire's ability to command the resources of the entire known world. And Commodus understood this symbolic dimension of the spectacle as clearly as any of his predecessors had. There is a specific incident involving a hippopotamus that the ancient sources describe with a particular vividness that suggests genuine contemporary astonishment. Commodus reportedly fought the hippopotamus in the arena, and the fight did not go entirely as planned. The hippopotamus was an animal that the Romans found difficult to manage, and whose behavior was less predictable than the lions and bears they were more accustomed to. The details of the specific incident vary in different sources, but the general impression is of a moment when the theatrical control that managed the arena spectacles momentarily slipped, and the genuine danger that the animal kingdom represented briefly asserted itself. The rhinoceros appears in another account that is similarly revealing. Commodus reportedly approached a rhinoceros in the arena, intending to demonstrate his mastery of the animal, and the rhinoceros demonstrated its own point of view on the encounter. The specific outcome varies in the sources, but the pattern of emperor versus rhinoceros is preserved in enough detail to suggest a real event of some kind that the contemporary audience found memorable. These moments, when the staged spectacle of Commodus's arena performances encountered the resistance of reality, are important precisely because they are the moments when the relationship between the theatrical and the genuine becomes visible. The performances were staged and the outcomes were managed, but the animals were real, and the weapons were real, and the physical space of the arena was real. And occasionally the management was less than perfect. The political dimension of the gladiatorial career is something that the purely psychological readings tend to underplay. There was a deliberate and consistent political message in Commodus's arena performances that went beyond personal gratification. By performing as a gladiator, by identifying with Hercules, by renaming himself and the empire, Commodus was making specific claims about what imperial authority was and where it came from. The traditional Roman understanding of imperial authority was that it derived from the Senate and the Roman people, that the emperor was the first citizen of a res publica, that his power was in some sense delegated from the community rather than inherent in the person. This was a fiction by the 3rd century, but it was a politically important fiction that the senatorial class depended on because it implied that the emperor was in some sense accountable to the tradition and values that the Senate represented. Commodus was rejecting this framework entirely. By grounding his authority in divine identity, by performing power as a personal attribute rather than an institutional role, by choosing the arena crowd over the Senate as his political constituency, he was proposing a completely different theory of what the emperor was. A theory in which the emperor's authority derived from his divine nature and his personal excellence, rather than from any political tradition or institutional relationship. This was not simply mad. It was a coherent, if extreme, position in a debate about imperial legitimacy that had been going on since Augustus, and it anticipated in some ways the explicitly divine imperial ideology that would become more prominent in the 3rd century and beyond. The later emperors, who would claim divine status more formally, were building on a tradition of divine pretension that Commodus had established in its most theatrical form. The specific relationship between Commodus's reign and the religious transformations of the Roman world is another dimension that deserves attention. The 3rd century was a period of significant religious change in the empire. The traditional civic religion was losing its hold on the educated classes, even as it maintained its ceremonial importance. Mystery religions and Eastern cults were spreading. The monotheistic traditions of Judaism and Christianity were growing in significance. Commodus's personal religious interests included devotion to the cult of Mithras, the mystery religion popular among soldiers, and to the cult of Isis and Osiris, the Egyptian religious tradition that had been spreading through the empire since the Hellenistic period. His Hercules identification was itself a form of divine claim that operated in a different register from traditional Roman civic religion. And the combination of these various religious enthusiasms reflected the syncretic and searching quality of the religious environment of the late 2nd century. The persecution of Christians that is sometimes attributed to his reign requires careful examination. The general legal framework regarding Christians during his reign was not significantly different from that of his predecessors. Christianity remained an illegal religion in principle, and Christians were subject to persecution when local authorities chose to enforce the laws. But the evidence for systematic, empire-wide persecution under Commodus is thin, and there are accounts of specific interventions by people close to him, particularly his concubine, Marcia, that protected specific Christians from execution. Marcia, his concubine and one of the most important figures in the story of his downfall, is reported to have had personal connections to the Christian community and to have used her influence with Commodus to obtain the release of Christians condemned to the Sardinian mines, including a man named Callistus, who would later become Bishop of Rome. This specific intervention is documented in early Christian sources and gives Marcia a historically interesting position as someone who used proximity to the most powerful man in the empire to benefit a persecuted community. The women of Commodus's court are generally less present in the sources than the men, but they were real historical actors whose influence on events was significant. His wife, Crispina, whom he married before becoming sole emperor, was eventually accused of adultery and exiled, and later executed. The charges of adultery that were used to remove her from the picture were a standard tool of Roman imperial politics, and their reliability as evidence of actual conduct is limited. What is clear is that her removal was politically motivated and that the reasons given publicly bore uncertain relationship to the reasons that actually mattered. Marcia replaced Crispina in Commodus's personal life, if not in his official status, and she became one of the most influential people in the court. Her access to the emperor and her understanding of how to manage him made her a figure that the powerful men around Commodus cultivated and feared, and her eventual role in the conspiracy that killed him is one of the more remarkable aspects of the story. The conspiracy that ended Commodus's life grew out of the combination of senatorial resentment that had been building throughout the reign, and the more immediate and personal fears people closest to him who had learned that proximity to the emperor was no guarantee of safety and might become its opposite without warning letters. The Praetorian prefect was the central figure in the organization of the conspiracy. He had been raised to his position by Commodus as a replacement for the earlier Praetorian prefects who had fallen from favor, and he had initially been part of the apparatus that maintained Commodus's power. But he had received intelligence, or believed he had received intelligence, that Commodus was planning to kill him and replace him, and this threat to his own survival was sufficient to motivate the action. Eclectus, Commodus's chamberlain, was another conspirator, another man who had been raised to his position by the emperor, and who now believed that his survival required the emperor's death. The pattern of the conspirators being people who had benefited from Commodus and who now feared him is characteristic of a court culture in which the emperor's unpredictability had made calculation about the future impossible. Marcia completes the inner circle of the conspiracy. Her personal presence in the emperor's household gave her both the motive and the means, and the specific role she played in the assassination is described in the ancient sources with a dramatic vividness that reflects how the event was remembered. The plan that the conspirators settled on was to poison Commodus on the last day of December in 192 AD. Marcia served him wine that had been poisoned. He drank it, became ill, vomited, and the poison appeared not to be working quickly enough. A wrestler named Narcissus, who had access to Commodus, was brought in to finish the killing by strangling the emperor in his bath. The specific detail of the wrestler finishing the killing has a quality that is almost designed for historical memorability. The emperor of Rome, the man who had fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, the man who had identified with the greatest hero of classical mythology, was killed by a professional athlete in his bathtub on the last night of the year. There is a dark irony in the specific method that the ancient sources do not dwell on, but that the reader cannot miss. He was 31 years old. He had been emperor for 12 years. The reaction across the empire to the news of his assassination was varied in ways that the hostile literary tradition tends to flatten into universal relief. The Senate certainly was relieved. The senators who had been walking on eggshells for years, and who had feared at various points that the reign's increasingly extreme behavior would be directed at them, could finally breathe. The damnatio memoria that was voted by the Senate was completed with an enthusiasm that suggests genuine release of genuine fear. But the popular reaction was more complex. The games and the spectacles and the personal accessibility that Commodus had provided had real constituencies among the Roman population who had experienced his reign as one of unprecedented imperial entertainment. The accounts of popular mourning and of soldiers who refused to accept the damnatio memoria reflect a real division in how the reign was experienced by different parts of Roman society. Pertinax, who succeeded Commodus, lasted 87 days before being killed by the Praetorian Guard. His attempt to restore the strict discipline and fiscal austerity that he associated with proper imperial governance after the extravagance of Commodus' reign was not what the soldiers who had benefited from Commodus's generosity wanted, and the speed of his removal illustrated both the instability that Commodus's reign had created and the difficulty of returning to normalcy after 12 years of a very different kind of government. The year of the 5 emperors that followed Pertinax, in which the Praetorian Guard literally auctioned the imperial office to the highest bidder and multiple generals fought for power, was the immediate political consequence of the chaos that Commodus's reign had produced. The Severan dynasty that eventually emerged from that chaos and that produced Caracalla and Septimius Severus was a different kind of Roman imperial family, one that was more openly dependent on military force and less connected to the senatorial tradition, and its character was shaped partly by the demonstration that Commodus had given of where that tradition's vulnerabilities lay. The physical evidence of Commodus's reign is distributed across the empire in the form of inscriptions and coins and portraits, sculptures that give us a different kind of record from the literary sources. The portrait tradition in particular is interesting because it shows the visual evolution of the emperor's self-presentation over the course of the reign. The early portraits show a young man of conventional imperial appearance, clean-shaven in the fashion of the Antonine dynasty, with the idealized features that Roman imperial portraiture typically employed. The later portraits show something significantly different: the beard that Commodus adopted, probably in connection with his Hercules identification, since Hercules was typically depicted, the lion skin headdress that some portraits include as an attribute of the Herculean persona, and in some representations the club that was Hercules's characteristic weapon. The transformation of the portrait tradition across the reign reflects the transformation of the emperor's self-understanding in visible and datable form. The colossal statue that Commodus commissioned, showing himself as Hercules, combining his own facial features with the standard Herculean iconography, has survived in the Capitoline museums in Rome and is one of the most striking objects of Roman imperial art. It shows the emperor as a muscular figure with the lion skin over his shoulders and the club in one hand and the apples of the Hesperides in the other. His face, with its slightly heavy features, recognizable as the same face shown in the more conventional portraits. The combination is unsettling in a way that the artist probably intended. The coins of Commodus's reign document the Hercules identification with particular clarity because coins were produced in enormous numbers and distributed across the empire, and because the changes in coin iconography were a deliberate imperial communication strategy. The progression from conventional imperial imagery to explicitly Herculean imagery tracks the development of the identification from an occasional motif to a comprehensive persona replacement. By the end of the reign, the coins were showing not the emperor, but the divine hero, with only the legend providing the link to the actual historical person. The baths of Commodus in Rome are less famous than the baths of Caracalla, but they were a genuine public amenity that formed part of the legacy of the reign. Like Caracalla, he understood the political value of providing public amenities that served the entire population. His spending on spectacle and entertainment was in part an investment in the specific kind of popular legitimacy that the senatorial tradition was unable to provide, and that the arena and the circus could. The Colosseum itself was partially damaged by fire in 191 AD and required significant reconstruction. The repair and renovation work undertaken by Commodus is documented in inscriptions, and it included changes to the seating arrangements and the underground structures that supported the arena floor. The specific technical improvements that the renovation made to the functioning of the building are documented in archaeological studies, and they reflect an engagement with the arena as a working facility rather than simply as a stage for imperial performance. The relationship between Commodus and the city of Rome at the physical level, the buildings and spaces and public amenities that his reign added or modified, is part of his legacy that the purely literary accounts of gladiatorial insanity tend to obscure. He was not a great builder in the tradition of Hadrian or Trajan, but he was not indifferent to the physical fabric of the city and his contributions to it, though overshadowed by his other activities, were real. The detail of the reign that most popular accounts miss entirely, and that is perhaps the most illuminating about the actual functioning of the empire during this period, is the administrative record. The papyri and inscriptions and legal texts that document the daily business of governing 60 million people across millions of square kilometers continue throughout Commodus's reign without obvious disruption. The empire was governed, the taxes were collected, the frontier was maintained, the legal system continued to function. The administrative machinery that Marcus Aurelius had built and that previous emperors had refined continued to operate with the competence of its professional staff, regardless of what was happening in the arena. This administrative continuity is historically important because it demonstrates that the Roman imperial system, by the late 2nd century, had developed a degree of institutional resilience that allowed it to function even when the emperor was disengaged from its actual management. The officials and administrators who ran the day-to-day operations of governance were professionals who continued their work regardless of the theatrical spectacles that were consuming their emperor's attention. The empire was larger than any individual who governed it, and its functioning depended on systems that could survive considerable dysfunction at the top. The philosophical dimension of the reign that is most interesting and most frequently missed is the implicit critique that Commodus's behavior represents of the Stoic imperial tradition that his father embodied. Marcus Aurelius's meditations represent an ideal of self-denial and philosophical discipline that is genuinely admirable, but that also imposes a standard of self-abnegation that is almost inhuman in its demands. The emperor, who never allows himself pleasure, who experiences every luxury as a potential corruption, who measures every action against a philosophical standard of what the good emperor should do, is an ideal that serves the empire and destroys the person. Commodus's rejection of this ideal, his insistence on doing what he wanted and being what he wanted to be rather than what the role required, can be read as a kind of rebellion against the impossible standard his father represented. It was a rebellion that cost the empire and ultimately cost him his life, but it was not simply madness. It was a choice about how to live, made by a man who had grown up watching his father sacrifice everything personal for the impersonal demands of philosophy and power, and who had decided that this was not the bargain he wanted to accept. The tragedy of Commodus is not simply that he was a bad emperor following a good one. It is that the specific kind of goodness that Marcus Aurelius embodied was a kind that could not be taught or inherited. It was the product of a specific temperament and a specific life and a specific philosophical formation that Marcus had and that Commodus did not. And the attempt to produce a philosopher-emperor through biological inheritance rather than adoption of the best candidate was the fundamental mistake from which everything else followed. Marcus Aurelius chose to leave the empire to his biological son rather than to adopt a successor as his own predecessors in the five good emperors tradition had done. And this choice, made for reasons of paternal affection or political necessity or both, produced Commodus, and Commodus produced everything that followed. The assassination, the chaos, the Severan dynasty, the 3rd century crisis that would nearly destroy the empire. All of it can be traced in some meaningful sense to the decision that a dying emperor made to leave power to his son, rather than to the best available candidate. This is the deepest historical significance of the reign, and the one that rewards the most thought, not the gladiatorial spectacles, or the Hercules identification, or the renaming of Rome, but the demonstration that a system of government that depends on the personal qualities of one individual is always one biological accident away from catastrophe, that the genius of the adoptive succession that had produced Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius was not philosophical coincidence but a structural solution to a structural problem, and that the abandonment of that solution in favor of natural succession produced exactly the result that the West system had been designed to prevent. Commodus was not simply a bad person who happened to be emperor. He was the product of a system that had lost the mechanism for selecting good emperors, and that had not yet developed an alternative. He was the son of the best emperor Rome had produced, and he demonstrated, conclusively, that goodness does not reproduce itself through bloodline. The gladiator in the Colosseum was performing his own theory of what an emperor should be, performing it in the most public space available, in front of the largest possible audience, with all the physical reality that the arena provided. And the theory was wrong, was dangerous, was ultimately self-destructive, but it was not simply mad. It was the theory of a man who had decided that the authentic expression of power was more important than the conventional performance of it, and who was willing to pay any price for the freedom to be what he actually was, rather than what everyone told him he should be. The price he paid was everything, and the world went on. And 2,000 years later, we are still talking about the night that the Emperor of Rome walked into the greatest arena ever built and picked up a gladiator's sword. Not because it was the most important thing he did, but because it is the most human thing he did, the most nakedly human demonstration of what happens when a person who has been told all their life that they must be something other than themselves finally decides they will not. And if that sounds familiar, it should. History keeps telling this story because it is not an ancient story. It is the story of power and identity and the impossible demands that one places on the other. And it is not finished if you have made it this far. You have spent time with one of the most complex and most misunderstood emperors in Roman history. Not the cartoon villain of the film Gladiator, not simply the mad son of Marcus Aurelius, but a real person navigating an impossible position in ways that were destructive and human and genuinely illuminating about the nature of power and identity and the costs that both extract. If this story has given you something to think about, leave a comment about which part surprised you most. We read every one. Share this video with someone who loves Roman history. And subscribe if you have not already, because there are dozens more stories like this one waiting. The Colosseum is quiet tonight. The sand floor that Commodus walked on is gone, replaced by the wooden structure of the modern restoration. But the walls are still standing, and the space is still the same space. And if you stand in it in the early morning before the tourists arrive, you can feel something of what it was. Enormous and intimate at the same time, built for spectacle and for death, built for the specific human need to watch something extraordinary. And in the early morning light, if you are quiet enough, you can almost hear it, the crowd and the emperor walking in. The world that Commodus walked through when he was not in the arena was the world of late Antonine Rome, a city at the peak of its physical magnificence and beginning to show the first signs of the stress. The Rome of 180 AD was a city of approximately 1 million people living in an urban fabric that had been accumulating buildings and monuments for nearly 9 centuries. From the ancient temples of the Forum to the relatively recent Pantheon rebuilt by Hadrian, from the Colosseum completed only a century earlier to the Column of Marcus Aurelius still under construction, the Column of Marcus Aurelius, which commemorated the Danubian campaigns in a series of carved relief scenes spiraling up its length, was being completed during the early years of Commodus's reign, and it stands today in the Piazza Colonna in Rome as one of the most visible physical monuments to the period. The contrast between the philosophical-emperor, commemorated in the spiraling marble reliefs, and his son who preferred the sand floor of the Colosseum, is one that the monument emphasizes simply by existing. A monument to one kind of imperial excellence standing in the city, while another kind was being performed in the arena. The food that Romans ate in this period, the markets and the cooking and the specific textures of daily life, are documented in sources that the political histories tend to ignore, but that give substance to the world we are trying to understand. The thermopolia, the hot food counters that lined the streets of every Roman city, served a population that mostly lived in apartment buildings without kitchens or with inadequate facilities for cooking. The menu that these establishments offered included stewed pulses and grain porridge and sausages and wine and whatever seasonal vegetables were available in the markets that supplied them. The wealthy ate differently. The elaborate dinner parties of the Roman aristocracy, the triclinium, where guests reclined on couches around low tables and were served course after course by skilled domestic staff, the rare foods imported from the provinces and beyond, the wines of specific vintages and origins that the educated drinker could identify and compare. All of this was the material culture of the class that produced the literary sources, and that Commodus alternately patronized and antagonized throughout his reign. The specific food preferences attributed to Commodus in the ancient sources are probably exaggerated for satirical effect, but they preserve something real about the way his reign was experienced. The accounts of elaborate feasts that mixed the sacred and the profane, that combined genuine luxury with deliberate vulgarity, that reflected the emperor's desire to shock the aristocratic sensibility, while simultaneously demonstrating his power to command any pleasure he wanted. These accounts are consistent with the broader pattern of a man who understood the conventions of his social world well enough to violate them deliberately. The Circus Maximus, which occupied the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, and which could hold perhaps 250,000 spectators, was the other great venue of Roman public entertainment, and one that was central to Commodus's political relationship with the Roman crowd. The chariot racing that the circus hosted was the most popular spectacle in Rome, drawing crowds that dwarfed even the arena. And the racing factions, the blues and greens and reds and whites, were political as much as sporting institutions, their colors identifying constituencies in the complex, informal politics of the city. Commodus's relationship with the racing factions reflected his general approach to popular politics. He was generous with the factions he favored and willing to use his imperial authority to influence race outcomes in ways that made him enormously popular with some parts of the crowd and correspondingly unpopular with others. The politics of the circus were in some ways more genuinely popular in the sense of reflecting the preferences of the broader urban population than anything that happened in the Senate. And Commodus's engagement with them was a form of political intelligence, even when its specific expressions looked like mere indulgence. The slaves and freedmen who made up a significant portion of Rome's population during this period had their own relationship to the Commodus reign that the literary sources almost entirely ignore, because the literary sources were produced by and for the senatorial aristocracy that found Commodus so offensive. The gladiators who trained with him and performed alongside him in the arena were mostly enslaved people or people of very low legal status, and his willingness to share their space and their activity was experienced by this part of the population differently from how it was experienced by senators, who considered gladiatorial fighting degrading. The freedmen who held significant positions in Commodus's court, Soterus and Clender, were individuals whose rise to power through the emperor's favor was possible, precisely because Commodus was less bound by the traditional aristocratic preference for personnel from the senatorial class. This relative openness to talent from outside the traditional elite was one of the more structurally interesting aspects of his reign, even if its specific expressions were often personally catastrophic for the individuals involved. The legal work of the reign, which proceeded largely independently of the emperor's personal preoccupations, produced a body of jurisprudence that contributed to the development of Roman law in the generation before the great Severan jurists. The rescripts and legal decisions of the period that are preserved in legal compilations show a functioning legal system that was engaging with the practical questions of an enormous and complex empire with reasonable competence. The legal machinery of Rome continued to work even when the emperor was in the arena. The military situation on the frontiers during Commodus's reign was generally stable. The peace that he had made with the Danubian peoples when he withdrew from his father's campaign was maintained without major incident throughout most of the reign. The British frontier required attention, and the governor, Ulpius Marcellus, conducted a successful campaign there, extending or re-establishing Roman control north of Hadrian's Wall in 184 AD. The specific details of this campaign are preserved in inscriptions that document military activity and in the coins that celebrated the victory. The mutiny of the army in Britain that followed Marcellus's success is one of the more interesting episodes of the reign, and one that illustrates the complex relationship between the emperor and the military during this period. The British legions sent a delegation to Rome with a specific complaint against Perennis, the Praetorian prefect, who was at that moment the most powerful man in the empire after the emperor. The soldiers accused Perennius of systematically replacing senatorial commanders in the provinces with equestrian officers who were personally loyal to him rather than to the imperial system. The specific accusation was that Perennis was building a personal power base that could be used against the emperor himself, and Commodus's response to the delegation and to the accusation was to sacrifice Perennis to the soldiers, having him delivered to them for execution in a scene that is one of the more dramatically revealing moments of the reign. The emperor, who had elevated Perennis to his enormous position, simply handed him over when it became politically convenient to do so, demonstrating once again the fundamental vulnerability of everyone who depended on imperial favor. The disease and public health crises of the reign deserve mention because they were significant events that affected the population of the empire in ways that the political and military history tends to obscure. The Antonine Plague that had first struck the empire in the 160s under Marcus Aurelius was still recurring in periodic outbreaks during Commodus's reign. The specific outbreak that struck Rome in 189 AD was severe enough to be recorded in multiple sources. Cassius Dio reports 2,000 deaths per day at the peak of the outbreak, a figure that is almost certainly exaggerated, but that reflects a genuinely significant mortality event. The medical response to the plague during this period was limited by the state of Roman medical knowledge. The humoral theory that governed medical practice could offer supportive care and dietary advice, but had no effective treatments for epidemic disease. The social response involved the kinds of measures that ancient cities had always used in times of epidemic: the suspension of public gatherings, the provision of burial assistance for the poor who could not afford normal funeral arrangements, the propitiation of the gods through public ceremonies designed to end divine punishment. The specific role of the emperor in managing public health crises was primarily symbolic and ceremonial. The performance of religious rituals designed to appease the gods and end the plague was part of the imperial function, and Commodus performed these rituals as his predecessors had. The practical measures of distribution and burial assistance that helped the population through the worst of the outbreak were managed through the administrative machinery of the city, rather than through direct imperial action. The relationship between the plague and the religious transformations of the period is one of those connections that is speculative but historically plausible. Epidemic disease that killed indiscriminately, and for which traditional medicine had no effective response, created conditions in which people sought religious traditions that offered better explanations and better comfort than the traditional civic religion could provide. The mystery religions and the emerging Christian tradition both offered things that the traditional religion of Rome could not: a personal relationship with a divine power who cared about individual human beings, the promise of personal survival beyond death, the community support of fellow believers in times of crisis. The specifically Christian response to the plague, documented in Christian sources from the period, involved the community care of the sick, regardless of whether they were Christian. The willingness of Christians to nurse plague victims and to arrange proper burials for the dead of all communities. And this practical response to the epidemic was one of the factors that attracted people to the Christian community in ways that theological argument alone would not have achieved. The gladiatorial games that Commodus was performing in this same period, the years of the 189 plague, create a specific historical juxtaposition that rewards contemplation. The emperor in the arena performing his Hercules fantasy while the city around him died of disease is an image that captures something essential about the disconnection between the emperor's personal priorities and the actual needs of his population. This is not to say that Commodus could have stopped the plague or that his arena performances were in any direct sense responsible for the deaths, but the juxtaposition illustrates the particular quality of the disengagement from governance that characterized the reign. The intellectual life of Rome during this period continued to produce significant work despite or alongside the political dysfunction. The second sophistic tradition was at its height, producing elaborate performances of rhetorical skill that drew large audiences. The philosophical schools continued their teaching. The legal scholars continued their work. The medical writers of the period, including Galen, who was active during Commodus's reign, were producing the most systematic accounts of medical knowledge that the ancient world would generate. Galen's presence in Rome during this period is historically significant because his medical writings would become the authoritative framework for medical theory and practice in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. His synthesis of Hippocratic and Aristotelian approaches to medicine, his detailed anatomical studies, his systematic pharmacology, all of this was produced in the specific intellectual environment of the Antonine and early Severan periods. And the political events of Commodus's reign form the background against which this intellectual achievement was accomplished. The question of what the ordinary population of the empire knew about Commodus and how they experienced his reign is one that the literary sources cannot fully answer, but that the papyri and inscriptions begin to address. The papyri from Egypt that document everyday transactions and petitions and administrative decisions during the reign are a record of the empire functioning in its normal mode. People buying and selling property, settling disputes, appealing to official authorities for various forms of assistance. Their documents dated by the regnal years of Commodus without any particular indication that the emperor was doing anything unusual. This documentary normalcy is historically important because it demonstrates that the 12 years of the reign were not 12 years of total dysfunction, but 12 years during which the empire continued to operate as an empire while the emperor was doing things that the educated class found scandalous. The spectacles and the renames and the divine identification were visible in Rome and recorded by the literary tradition. But in the Egyptian countryside, or the Syrian city, or the British garrison town, the reign of Commodus was probably experienced primarily through the normal channels of taxation and administration, and the occasional coin with a new imperial image. The specific coins that circulated during the reign are a form of imperial communication that reached every part of the empire, and that document the evolution of the Herculean identification in ways that the literary sources describe, but the coins make visible. A coin hoard found in Britain, or the Balkans, or North Africa that includes Commodon issues will show the progression of the imagery from conventional to Herculean across the 12 years of the reign, and anyone who handled those coins was receiving a specific imperial message, whether they thought about it consciously or not. The message of the coins, the emperor as Hercules, the emperor as divine hero, the emperor as something other than a human being exercising a human political role, was a message designed for universal distribution, and it had effects that the literary sources focused on Rome and the Senate tend to underestimate. In the eastern provinces where divine kingship had deep roots, and where the Herculean identification would have resonated with local traditions of divine heroism, the message may have been received differently than in the senatorial circles of Rome, where it was read as madness or tyranny. The end of the reign, the assassination on the last night of 192 AD, was followed immediately by attempts to construct an official narrative that served the interests of the successors. The damnatio memoria that the Senate voted was the formal mechanism by which the official record was rewritten. Commodus's name was removed from inscriptions. His statues were melted down or refaced. His memory was declared accursed, and the historical tradition that would eventually record his reign was shaped from the beginning by the needs of people who had killed him, and who needed his killing to be justified. This shaping of the historical record is something that the modern reader has to account for when approaching any account of Commodus. The primary sources are hostile. The framing devices they use, the anecdotes they select, the emphasis they place on specific incidents, all of this reflects the perspective of people who had every reason to make him look as bad as possible, and no reason to present a balanced account. This does not mean everything they say is false. It means everything they say requires critical assessment. The specific anecdotes about Commodus that have been most influential in shaping his popular image the renaming of Rome, the gladiatorial performances, the Hercules identification, the various cruelties attributed to him, are real events distorted by selection and framing. The renaming happened, but it was reversed immediately after his death, and may have been more of a legal and ceremonial designation than the wholesale reimagination of the city that the hostile sources suggest. The gladiatorial performances happened, but they were staged in ways that minimized actual risk and reflected both genuine athletic interest and deliberate political theater rather than simple madness. The Hercules identification was a sustained political and theological project rather than a symptom of delusion. Understanding these distinctions does not rehabilitate Commodus or deny the real costs his reign imposed on the empire and its people. It simply makes the history more accurate and therefore more useful. A Commodus who was simply mad tells us nothing interesting. A Commodus who was making specific choices for specific reasons, however destructive those reasons were, tells us a great deal about power and identity and the specific pressures of the late Antonine period. The gladiator who was also an emperor, the emperor who wanted to be a god, the son who could not be his father, the ruler who preferred the arena to the council chamber. This is not a simple story, and it does not have a simple moral. It is the story of a human being making human choices in inhuman circumstances. And the fact that those choices were often wrong and sometimes catastrophic does not make the person behind them less interesting or less worth understanding. The Colosseum, where he performed, is still standing 2,000 years later, the greatest surviving monument of the Roman world, and in the specific space of the arena floor, where he walked with his gladiatorial weapons, you can stand today and look up at the tiers of seats that would have been packed with 200,000 Romans waiting to see what the emperor was going to do next. They did not know what was coming. He probably did not know either. And the not knowing, the improvisation, the willingness to walk into the most public space in the world without a script and make it up as he went, is perhaps the most Commodus thing about the whole story. For a man who was pretending to be a god, he was very human. And for a man who wanted to be remembered, he certainly was. The Colosseum is quiet tonight, and the sky above it is full of stars that were there before Rome was built, and will be there long after the last stone falls. And somewhere in the arc of all that time, a young man who was emperor and gladiator and Hercules and the son of the best emperor Rome ever produced is still walking toward the center of the sand, still raising his sword, still waiting for the crowd to roar. The crowd always roars. The specific training regime that Commodus maintained throughout his gladiatorial career is one of the details that speaks to the genuine rather than merely theatrical nature of his engagement with the arena. Gladiatorial training was physically demanding in ways that no modern sport quite replicates. The combination of weapons, skill, and conditioning, and the specific tactical knowledge of different gladiatorial styles required years of dedicated practice to develop. The gladiatorial schools of Rome, the Ludi, were professional training facilities with established programs and experienced trainers. And Commodus's training within this system was not ceremonial but substantive. The specific gladiatorial style that he practiced most was the secutor, one of the standard combat types, characterized by a smooth helmeted style that minimized the opportunities for an opponent's weapon to catch on the helmet. The secutor typically fought against the Natantrodent fighter, and the specific tactical challenge of this matchup, the Retiarius using mobility and ranged weapons to control space while the secutor pressed for close contact, was one that required genuine understanding and skill to navigate. Commodus practiced other styles as well. The sources describe him fighting as another type of heavily armed gladiator, and his archery practice occupied a different register entirely. The archery was performed from a platform in the arena rather than in direct combat, but the level of skill described, the specific shots, the accuracy at distance, the consistency of performance over extended sessions, reflects genuine dedicated practice rather than the casual demonstration of a man with no real commitment to the craft. The animals he fought in the arena, the bestiarious performances that were another category of arena spectacle, required a different but related set of skills. Fighting large animals required an understanding of animal behavior, of how lions and bears and other predators moved and attacked, of the specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited and the specific dangers that had to be avoided. The men who did this professionally as bestiari were trained specialists, whose work was genuinely dangerous and whose skills were developed over years. Commodus's bestiarious performances were managed to reduce the actual risk to the emperor. The animals were weakened or restrained, or worked in conditions that limited their ability to respond effectively. But the specific detail of the performances, the shots that killed ostriches on the run, the confrontations with large animals in the arena space, required at minimum genuine physical competence, and probably something more than that. A man who is simply pretending to be a gladiator does not practice for years and perform hundreds of times in a space where the management of the situation is never entirely perfect. The relationship between Commodus and the professional gladiators who trained with him and performed alongside him is one of the more humanly interesting aspects of the gladiatorial career. The gladiatorial schools contained men who were among the most skilled athletes in the Roman world, who had developed their abilities through years of training and combat, who understood the arena and its dynamics with the practical knowledge of professionals. And Commodus spent more time with these men than with the senators who ran the empire. The social world of the gladiatorial school was one of intense physical intimacy and mutual dependency. Men who trained together and fought together and survived together developed bonds that the hierarchical formality of the senatorial world did not produce. And Commodus's preference for this environment over the council chamber and the formal court is consistent with a man who found the direct physical reality of athletic training more satisfying than the indirect, symbolic reality of imperial governance. The names of the gladiators who appear in the sources in connection with Commodus are preserved as a list that is both humanizing and revealing. These are not simply categories or types, but individuals with names and presumably histories and personal characteristics. The specific men who trained with the emperor and who performed beside him in the arena were real people whose relationship to the most powerful man in the empire was one of physical proximity and shared activity. A combination that tends to produce genuine personal connection, even when the formal hierarchy separates the parties by an enormous distance. The political consequences of this personal connection were real. The gladiators who were close to Commodus had access and influence that the formal institutions of the empire did not provide. They were consulted, and their opinions mattered. They were present in the imperial household in ways that made them part of the informal network of advice and information that competed with the formal channels of governance. This was not unique to Commodus. Emperors throughout the period had informal advisors whose access to the emperor made them politically significant. But the specific category of gladiator as imperial intimate was an innovation that the pictorial tradition found particularly offensive. The sexual dimensions of Commodus's personal life are handled by the ancient sources with the combination of detail and disgust that reflects both the genuine interest of the topic and the rhetorical purposes it served. The sources that are most explicit about the sexual component of his gladiatorial relationships are also the most hostile and the least reliable in their specific claims. But the general picture of an emperor whose personal life reflected his rejection of the conventional aristocratic standards is consistent across sources of varying reliability. The harem of women and men that the sources describe as part of the imperial household, the specific names given to concubines and favorites, the accounts of sexual performances staged for imperial entertainment. These are the details that the hostile tradition preserved with particular enthusiasm and that the modern historian has to handle with particular care. They are almost certainly true in their general outline. They are almost certainly exaggerated in their specific detail, and their relevance to the history of the reign is mostly that they illustrate the systematic rejection of the behavioral norms that the aristocratic tradition associated with proper imperial conduct. Marcia, as we noted, was the most important of the personal relationships and the one with the most significant historical consequences. Her influence over Commodus was real, and her use of that influence for purposes beyond personal advancement, including the protection of Christian prisoners in the Sardinian mines, gives her a complexity that the other figures in his personal life do not have. She was not simply a concubine who happened to be close to power, but a person who exercised moral agency within the extremely constrained space that her position provided. The question of why Marcia participated in the assassination conspiracy, why she agreed to serve the poison that began the process of killing the man she had been living with and whose favor had defined her life, is one that the ancient sources address with varying degrees of plausibility. The account that she herself was on the list of people Commodus intended to execute, that she found the list and understood what it meant and responded with the most decisive action available to her, is the most commonly cited explanation, and it is psychologically coherent even if its specific details cannot be verified. The list that Marcia reportedly found is one of those historical details that has the quality of a story that has been refined through retelling, but that probably reflects a genuine historical reality. It is well enough attested in multiple sources to suggest a real event at its core, and it illuminates the atmosphere of the later years of the reign. An atmosphere in which the emperor's unpredictability had become so extreme that even the people closest to him could not feel secure, in which the constant low-level paranoia of the court had generated a genuine threat that the people threatened responded to in the only way they could. The final hours of the reign, the evening of December 31st in 192 AD, are described in the ancient sources with a narrative clarity that suggests either that the event was well documented by survivors, or that the story had been refined in the telling to the point of literary coherence. The dinner at which Marcia administered the poison, the illness that followed, the recovery that threatened the conspiracy's success, the summoning of Narcissus, the wrestling in the bath, the death, all of this has the shape of a story that knows where it is going and that has been organized around its ending. The specific choice of a wrestler to finish the killing is the kind of detail that lodges in the memory because of its irony. The man who had spent his reign performing physical excellence and identifying with the greatest hero of classical mythology was killed by someone who used physical force. There is a dark symmetry between the way Commodus had lived and the way he died that the ancient sources do not need to articulate because it articulates itself. The transition from Commodus to Pertinax to the year of the 5 emperors is one of the most rapid and dramatic political sequences in Roman history and understanding. It requires appreciating how completely 12 years had destabilized the political system. The Praetorian Guard that had been bought and managed through the reign was now a political actor, capable of determining succession for the highest bidder. The senatorial class that had been humiliated and terrorized for 12 years was eager to reassert itself, but lacked the institutional mechanisms to do so effectively. The army on the frontiers was loyal to no one in particular, and available to the commander who would pay them appropriately. Pertinax's attempt to restore the strict disciplines and financial austerity that he associated with good governance was a political miscalculation of the first order. The guard that had lived well under Commodus did not want the return of the standards that Pertinax represented, and they killed him within 3 months. Then sold the imperial office in a literal auction at the Praetorian camp to the highest bidder, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who turned out not to have the military support to hold what he had bought. The civil war that followed involved the governors of Britain, the Danube, and Syria declaring their legions for themselves, and the outcome was determined by the military balance between the competing forces. Septimius Severus, the Danubian commander, was closest to Rome geographically and moved with the speed that turned military proximity into political advantage. His dynasty would rule for the next 4 decades, and its character, more openly dependent on military force, less connected to the senatorial tradition, more willing to claim divine status explicitly, was shaped by the lessons of what Commodus had done and what the year of chaos after his death had demonstrated. The memory of Commodus was treated differently by different parts of the Severan tradition. Septimius Severus rehabilitated him formally, having him deified, which was a politically motivated act designed to establish a connection between the new dynasty and the popular emperor whose games and performances had given him a real constituency. The deification also implicitly justified the assassination by framing Commodus as someone who had ascended to divine status rather than been murdered by his household. Caracalla, who idolized Alexander the Great, had his own relationship to the memory of Commodus. Both men had preferred the company of soldiers to the formal court. Both had identified with specific divine and heroic figures. Both had used the arena as a political space. The specific differences in how they expressed these shared tendencies reflected the different circumstances of their reigns and the different resources they had available rather than any fundamental difference in orientation. The Historia Augusta, the collection of imperial biographies that is one of the major sources for the period, treats Commodus with the mixture of sensationalism and occasional insight that characterizes its treatment of most emperors. Its life of Commodus contains both material that appears to be derived from genuine historical sources and material that is clearly invented or embellished. The challenge for the historian is distinguishing between the two, a challenge that is made more difficult by the fact that the text was probably compiled in the late 4th century from sources of varying quality that are no longer available for direct comparison. The specific anecdotes in the Historia Augusta that have been most influential in shaping popular understanding of Commodus, the stories about his cruelties to senators and to the physically disabled and to various classes of unfortunate Romans, need to be approached with particular skepticism because they are the kind of stories that serve the specific rhetorical purposes of the hostile tradition most directly. They demonstrate the emperor's inhumanity and arbitrariness in ways that justify the assassination and the damnatio memoria, and they are therefore exactly the kind of stories that would be invented or exaggerated if they were not already available from genuine sources. This does not mean Commodus was not cruel. The evidence for genuine cruelty is sufficient without the most extreme anecdotes. It means that the specific content of the cruelty stories cannot be taken at face value and needs to be assessed against the broader pattern of what we know about him from more reliable sources. A pattern that shows a man who is genuinely dangerous to people in his immediate political environment, who executed people for real and suspected disloyalty, who used the mechanisms of imperial power for personal and arbitrary ends. But who was not the systematic sadist that the worst accounts suggest? The film Gladiator, released in 2000, created the version of Commodus that most people alive today have encountered. And it is worth saying clearly that the film's Commodus is almost entirely fictional. The specific plot of the film bears no relationship to anything that actually happened during the reign. The character of Maximus is invented. The relationship between Commodus and Marcus Aurelius, depicted in the film's opening scenes, does not correspond to the historical account of Marcus's death, and the arena finale is pure invention. What the film captures, despite its historical inaccuracy, is something real about the psychological dynamic of the reign, the portrait of a man who was never going to be his father, who knew it, and who responded by becoming something entirely different. Is not historically wrong, even if all the specific details are invented. The film's Commodus is a villain, but he is a villain with a coherent and recognizable inner life. And that coherence is closer to the historical reality than a purely sensational account would be. The question that the film poses, implicitly but clearly, about whether a system that places absolute power in the hands of an individual has any mechanism for correcting itself when that individual is wrong, is exactly the question that the historical reign poses in a different register. The film's answer is a heroic gladiator who fights back. History's answer was a conspiracy of his own household that succeeded on the last night of the year. Neither answer is entirely satisfying, and perhaps the point is that there is no entirely satisfying answer. That systems built around individual authority are always vulnerable to the individual's failures in ways that no specific mechanism can fully prevent. That the 5 good emperors who preceded Commodus were as much an accident of personal virtue as a product of the adoptive system that selected them. And that the adoption of the best available candidate cannot guarantee virtue any more than biological succession can. The Rome that survived Commodus and the chaos that followed was not the Rome of Marcus Aurelius. It had been changed by the reign and by its aftermath in ways that were not reversible. The authority of the Senate had been reduced further. The dependence of imperial power on military force had been made more explicit. The possibility of divine imperial claims had been demonstrated in a way that subsequent emperors could build on. The relationship between the emperor and the professional soldiers, including the specifically skilled professionals of the gladiatorial world, had been renegotiated in ways that the traditional aristocratic framework could not accommodate. All of this was part of the long transformation of the Roman imperial system from the Principate of Augustus toward the Dominate of the late Empire. From the pretense of republican consultation toward the explicit claim of divine monarchy. From the fictional first citizen toward the actual sacred ruler. And Commodus was one of the forces that drove this transformation. Not because he planned it, but because his specific choices and their specific consequences moved the system in directions that could not be entirely reversed. The man in the arena had more historical significance than the man who stayed in the council chamber would have had, not despite his failures, but because of them, because the specific ways in which he failed exposed the specific vulnerabilities of the system that his success would have concealed. The emperor who fought as a gladiator told the Roman world something true about power that the emperor who governed philosophically was too careful to say aloud. Power is physical. It rests ultimately on the willingness to do violence. It cannot be entirely clothed in the dignified language of philosophy and law without someone eventually pointing at the man behind the toga. Commodus pointed at himself deliberately, repeatedly, in the largest public space in the world. And whatever else this was, it was not dishonest. The toga is still on display in museums. The philosopher's meditations are still read by millions. and the Colosseum is still standing, with its sand floor gone and its underground tunnels open to the tourists who walk through what was once the infrastructure of the most spectacular performances of the ancient world. And somewhere in those tunnels, in the waiting rooms where gladiators stood before the gates opened, you can feel something that no amount of reading quite conveys: the particular quality of the moment before the performance begins, the particular combination of preparation and uncertainty, the knowledge that whatever happens next will happen in front of 200,000 people who have come to see something extraordinary. Commodus walked out of those tunnels and into the light of the arena, and he was emperor and gladiator and Hercules and Marcus Aurelius's son, who would never be Marcus Aurelius. And the crowd roared, and history remembered. The provincial cities of the empire during Commodus's reign were not simply passive recipients of what happened in Rome. They were active participants in the imperial system who experienced the reign in specific ways depending on their location, their economic function, and their relationship to the military and administrative structures that connected them to the center. Antioch in Syria, one of the largest cities in the empire and the capital of the eastern provinces, experienced Commodus's reign through the lens of a city that was simultaneously deeply Roman in its administrative structures and deeply Greek and Syrian in its cultural life. The Greek-speaking population of Antioch had its own relationship to the imperial tradition, its own way of engaging with imperial claims and imperial spectacle, and the specific question of how Commodus's Hercules identification translated into the Greek cultural tradition that knew Hercules as Heracles, as a figure with a different but equally rich mythological history, is one that the sources do not address directly, but that was presumably worked out in the specific cultural negotiations of each local community. Carthage in North Africa, the great city that Rome had destroyed and rebuilt, was by the Antonine period one of the most prosperous cities in the Western Empire, the second city of the Latin-speaking world after Rome itself, a center of Latin literary culture and philosophical activity, and a city whose own history gave it a specific relationship to Roman power that was different from cities that had been Roman since the Republic. The experience of Commodus's reign in Carthage was mediated by all of this history and all of this specific positioning within the empire. Alexandria in Egypt, the most important city in the empire after Rome, had its own relationship to each successive emperor that was shaped by the city's history, its intellectual tradition, its diverse population, and its specific importance to the grain supply that fed Rome. The coins of Commodus that circulated in Alexandria were produced by the Alexandrian Mint with specific iconographic programs that reflected both the central imperial imagery and local adaptations, and the Herculean imagery that dominated the Roman coinage was given a specifically Egyptian inflection in the Alexandrian production. The provinces of Britain at the northernmost edge of the empire experienced the reign primarily through the military events of Ulpius Marcellus's campaign and the subsequent mutiny that sent a delegation to Rome. The soldiers who marched to Hadrian's Wall and beyond under Marcellus were fighting for an emperor whose gladiatorial performances were the subject of rumor and probably bewilderment in the camps of the northern frontier. The coins, with their Herculean imagery, communicated a specific message, but the interpretation of that message in a British military garrison was necessarily different from its interpretation in the Colosseum. The empire's relationship with the peoples beyond its frontiers during this period is another dimension that the purely internal history of the reign tends to ignore. The Parthian Empire to the east was in a relatively stable relationship with Rome during Commodus's reign. The peace that had been established at the end of his father's Parthian War continued without major disruption, and the management of the relationship was handled through the normal channels of diplomacy and frontier administration, without requiring the kind of direct imperial attention that the Danubian Wars had demanded of Marcus Aurelius. The Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube frontiers continued to be a potential source of trouble, but the peace arrangements that Commodus had made at the beginning of his reign generally held. The military situation on both frontiers was managed by the governors and commanders on the spot, without major crisis requiring imperial intervention. This frontier stability was part of what allowed Commodus to disengage from active military leadership without immediate catastrophic consequences. Though the long-term effects of disengagement from the frontier policy that Marcus had been pursuing were real, even if they were not immediately visible, the trade that connected the empire to the wider world continued throughout the reign without obvious disruption. The ships that carried grain from Egypt and North Africa to Asia, the merchants who brought silk from the east and spices from India, through the trading networks of the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea, the amber and furs and slaves that came down from the Baltic through the Germanic territories. All of this continued as it had before Commodus became emperor and would continue after him. The commercial life of the empire was driven by forces that were largely independent of whatever was happening in the arena. The specific luxury goods that were fashionable in the Commodus court reflected both the continuing vitality of the trade networks and the specific tastes of an emperor who had been raised in the most privileged environment in the world, and who had no reason to restrain his personal preferences. The accounts of the court's material culture that the hostile sources preserve, often with the intention of demonstrating extravagance and waste, inadvertently document the extraordinary range of goods that were available in imperial Rome and the specific aesthetic preferences of the period. The purple dye that was one of the most expensive substances in the ancient world, extracted from marine mollusks in enormous quantities to produce the small amounts of truly imperial purple cloth, was not simply a luxury, but a political marker. The right to wear full imperial purple was reserved in theory to the emperor alone, and the management of this specific sumptuary privilege was part of the symbolic grammar of imperial authority. Commodus's relationship to these conventions was as complicated as his relationship to all the other conventions of the imperial role, sometimes observing them and sometimes deliberately violating them in ways designed to make a specific point. The silk that came from China through the Parthian intermediaries was another luxury good that had specific imperial associations. Silk garments were worn by the wealthy across the empire, and silk's specific physical qualities, its lightness, its sheen, its ability to hold dye in vivid colors, made it a preferred material for the elaborate dress of the upper classes. The specifically imperial silk that the court used was produced and dyed, two specifications that distinguished it from the commercially available product, maintaining the visual hierarchy that imperial dress was supposed to communicate. The food at the imperial table, the most elaborate version of the banquet culture that was central to aristocratic social life in Rome, was a demonstration of imperial reach and imperial resources that served political purposes as much as gustatory ones. The specific delicacies that the sources attribute to Commodus's table, fish from distant waters, exotic birds from Africa and Asia, specialized preparations that required skilled cooks and expensive ingredients, were not simply self-indulgence, but the performance of imperial abundance that was expected of a ruler who commanded the resources of the world. The kitchens that supported the imperial household were themselves a significant organizational undertaking. The staff required to produce the constant stream of imperial entertaining, the specialists in various culinary traditions, the bakers and pastry makers and sauce specialists, the people responsible for the wines and the presentation and the serving, constituted a household within the household whose operation required management and resources comparable to a small city. The architectural spaces of the Palatine Palace that accommodated all of this activity are only partially recoverable from the archaeological record. Centuries of later building and the erosion of the structures themselves have obscured much of the specific layout and character of the spaces that Commodus inhabited. But the surviving elements of the Domitianic palace that formed the core of the complex and the traces of subsequent additions give some sense of the physical environment. The scale of the audience chambers and the dining rooms and the private apartments, the views from the hillside over the city below, the specific combination of public and private space that the imperial palace had to accommodate, the gardens of the Palatine, which are documented in ancient descriptions and partially recoverable from archaeological work, provided the outdoor environment of the imperial household, the spaces for exercise and relaxation, and the cultivation of the specific plants and trees that Roman garden design favored. These gardens were not simply decorative, but functional spaces that provided the imperial household with fresh produce, with the specific herbs that were central to Roman cooking and medicine, and with the outdoor environments that were essential to the health of people living in the most urban context in the Western world. The specific animals that Commodus kept in the imperial menagerie are documented in the accounts of his arena performances and give some sense of the scale and diversity of what the imperial household maintained. Exotic animals from across the empire and beyond, maintained for the emperor's personal interest and for eventual use in arena performances, required specialized care and accommodation that was itself a significant logistical undertaking. The keepers who managed these animals were specialists in their particular fields, whose knowledge was both practically necessary and culturally interesting to an emperor who was fascinated by the physical reality of the natural world. The relationship between Commodus's personal fascination with animals, both in the arena and in the menagerie, and the broader Roman cultural attitude toward the natural world is one that rewards consideration. The Romans were not naturalists in the modern sense, but they had a practical and sometimes detailed knowledge of the animals they encountered in trade, in agriculture, in military operations, and in arena entertainment. The encyclopedic tradition represented by Pliny the Elder's natural history, written a century before Commodus, documented what Romans knew and believed about the animal world with both genuine observation and considerable legend. The specific animals that Commodus fought in the arena were not merely entertainment, they were also political geography. The giraffe from sub-Saharan Africa, the elephant from India, the lion from North Africa, the bear from Germany. Each of these animals represented a specific territory and a specific relationship between that territory and Rome. And the emperor who killed them was performing imperial mastery over the entire known world, making the abstract fact of empire visible and visceral in a way that administrative records and legal documents could not. The final years of the reign, the years from approximately 190 to 192 AD, saw the gladiatorial performances and the Herculean identification reach their most extreme expressions at the same time that the political situation was becoming most unstable. The killing of Clendor in 190 AD, the administrative chaos that followed, the increasing isolation of the emperor from the normal channels of governance, the appearance of the list of people to be killed. All of this created an atmosphere in the imperial court that the sources describe as one of constant and escalating fear. In this atmosphere, the conspiracy that killed Commodus was not the act of people with principled objections to the gladiatorial performances or the renaming of Rome, or the proculus identification. It was the act of people who believed they were going to be killed, and who responded by killing first. The principled objections and the theatrical absurdities provided the justification for the historical narrative, but the actual motivation was much simpler and much more understandable. Survival, the conspiracy and its success. The assassination on the last night of 192 was not a triumph of principle over tyranny in the way that the historical tradition presents it. It was a desperate act of self-preservation by people who had concluded that the alternative to action was death. And the fact that it succeeded where earlier conspiracies and earlier crises had not reflects as much about the specific circumstances of that particular night as about any larger historical force. The history of Rome continued the next morning without him. The machinery of empire turned over. The new emperor was chosen. The games went on. The grain ships arrived at Ostia. The legions stood on their frontiers. The jurists wrote their opinions. The merchants conducted their trades, and the city that had roared for him in the arena went about its ordinary business as cities always do after the extraordinary thing has passed. The ordinary business of Rome going about itself after the extraordinary has passed is perhaps the deepest truth that the history of any individual emperor can tell us. The empire was larger than any of them, more durable than any of them, more various and more human than any single story can capture. Commodus was real, and his choices mattered, and their consequences lasted. But Rome was real too, and Rome lasted longer. In the tunnels beneath the Colosseum, where the gladiators waited, there is a specific quality of light and sound that is unlike anything above ground. The light is different, coming from below and from the sides, rather than from above. The sound is different, the roar of the crowd reaching down in a way that is felt as much as heard. And in that specific sensory environment, the waiting has a particular quality. The knowledge that the gate will open and the light will change, and what happens next will happen in front of everyone. Commodus walked through that gate 1,200 times, more or less. The sources disagree on the exact count. And each time he walked into the light of the arena, he was making a choice about who he wanted to be and how he wanted to be seen. And the choice he made consistently was to be the man who was good enough at this specific thing that the crowd responded genuinely, without the coercion that the senatorial tradition insisted was the only explanation for the applause. He was not good enough at being emperor. He was not good enough at being Marcus Aurelius's son. He was not good enough at the philosophical discipline that his father had modeled. But in the arena, with the sand under his feet and the crowd above him, and the specific clarity of a situation where the measures of success and failure are physical and immediate, he was something, and what he was, in that specific context, was enough. The sun is low over the Colosseum now. The tourists have gone. The light is golden, and the shadows are long. And the space that Commodus walked in is still there, changed and unchanged, wearing 2,000 years of history like a second skin. Somewhere in that space, the choice he kept making, the choice to be the emperor who fought, is still present in the way that choices made in a place are somehow retained by the place itself, absorbed into the stone and the sand and the specific geometry of the arena. He was not the best emperor Rome had. He was not the worst. He was one of the most human, one of the most nakedly driven by the specific combination of ambition and insecurity and genuine ability that produces people who do large things in wrong ways and memorable things in the wrong places. And the crowd roared, as crowds always have, for the spectacle, for the gladiator, for the emperor who was willing to be both. The specific question of what the Roman crowd actually thought of Commodus as a gladiatorial performer, as opposed to what the senatorial sources tell us they thought, is one that requires reading against the grain of the tradition. The the senators who wrote the history, and the senators whose social world produced the literary culture that preserved the memory of the reign had every reason to insist that the crowd was simply terrified into applause, that the enthusiasm was manufactured, that no genuine Roman could admire an emperor who degraded the dignity of the imperial office by entering the arena. But the sociology of Roman crowd behavior suggests a more complicated picture. The Roman crowd at the games was not a passive audience controlled by imperial authority. It was an active participant in the spectacle, whose approval and disapproval had real political weight, and whose enthusiasms were not easily manufactured by imperial command. The history of Roman crowd behavior at the games is full of instances where the crowd expressed opinions that the authorities found inconvenient, where the acclamations and the counter-demonstrations in the arena communicated political messages that went directly against what the emperor or the magistrates wanted to hear. A crowd of 200,000 people that was simply acting out of fear of the man performing in front of them would not have produced the specific quality of enthusiasm that the sources describe at Commodus's best performances, the spontaneous quality, the specific details of crowd response that the hostile sources preserve despite their hostility, the accounts of genuine surprise and genuine appreciation at specific feats. These are the details that a purely coerced audience does not produce. They are the responses of people who are genuinely watching something extraordinary and responding to it as such. The extraordinary thing they were watching was not simply a man killing animals. It was the emperor of Rome doing something that emperors were not supposed to do, crossing a line that was supposedly performing in the space that was reserved for people without dignity in the Roman social hierarchy, and doing it with enough genuine competence that the performance itself demanded a response from the athletic appreciation that Roman crowd culture had cultivated through generations of watching the best fighters in the world. The Roman crowd that had watched gladiatorial combat for centuries had developed sophisticated standards of judgment. They knew what good fighting looked like. They understood the specific skills required by different gladiatorial styles. They could distinguish between a technically competent performance and a genuinely excellent one. And whatever the quality of Commodus's performances in absolute terms, the specific combination of technical competence and imperial transgression that he offered was genuinely unique and genuinely compelling in ways that mere coercion cannot explain. The political economy of the games during Commodus's reign is another dimension of the story that rewards attention. The cost of providing gladiatorial entertainment at the scale that Commodus demanded was substantial. The acquisition and maintenance of gladiators, the import of exotic animals, the organizational infrastructure of staging multiple days of games in sequence. All of this required resources that came ultimately from the imperial treasury, which meant from the taxation of the empire's population. The question of whether the expenditure was politically justified in terms of the popular support it purchased was one that Roman emperors had been calculating since Augustus. The provision of entertainment was a form of political expenditure that bought a specific kind of loyalty from the urban population of Rome, and the calculation was generally that the loyalty purchased was worth the cost. Commodus's version of this expenditure was more extreme in its personal dimension than any previous emperor's, but it was continuous with a tradition of imperial entertainment that stretched back through the Republic, the gladiatorial schools of Rome. The ludi that trained the fighters who performed in the arena were imperial institutions by the Commodus period, having been brought under imperial control by earlier emperors, who understood that the supply of gladiators was a political resource that needed to be managed. The schools were located outside the city walls in the areas near the Colosseum, and they contained training facilities. accommodation for the gladiators and their support staff, medical facilities, and the administrative apparatus needed to manage a large population of highly trained athletes. The gladiators themselves were mostly enslaved people or convicted criminals who had been assigned to the schools. But there were also free men who had signed contracts with the schools voluntarily, drawn by the combination of regular food, accommodation, medical care, and the possibility of celebrity status that the arena could provide. The legal status of the gladiator was formally that of infamia, social disgrace, but the practical reality of the celebrity gladiator's life was considerably more complex and more interesting than the formal legal category suggested. The fan culture around gladiators that existed in Roman society is documented in graffiti from Pompeii and in artistic representations across the empire. The names and records of specific gladiators were known and celebrated. Their victories were commemorated, their deaths were mourned, and their personal characteristics were discussed and debated in the way that modern sports celebrities are discussed and debated. The gladiatorial fan culture was real, and it provided one of the cultural contexts within which Commodus's arena activities were received and understood. The medical care provided to gladiators in the imperial schools was surprisingly sophisticated by the standards of the era. The gladiatorial doctors who worked in the schools had accumulated practical knowledge about traumatic injury that was, in some respects, more advanced than the theoretical medicine of the academic tradition. The specific injuries produced by arena combat, the cuts and punctures and blunt force traumas that were the occupational hazards of gladiatorial work, required treatments that the gladiatorial doctors had developed through practical experience rather than theoretical training. Galen, the great physician who practiced in Rome during both Marcus Aurelius's and Commodus's reigns, had worked early in his career as a physician to the gladiatorial school in Pergamon, and he credited this experience with some of the most important practical medical knowledge he possessed. The connection between gladiatorial medicine and the development of Roman medical knowledge is one of those historical connections that rewards contemplation. The most dangerous profession in Rome was also one of the sources of the most practically advanced medical knowledge available in the ancient world. The architecture of the Colosseum itself, which was the primary venue for Commodus's arena performances, is worth understanding in some detail because the building was not simply a bowl for spectators, but an extraordinarily sophisticated machine for staging spectacle at the largest possible scale. The underground structures, the hypogeum, that supported the arena floor were a complex of tunnels and rooms and lifting mechanisms that could bring animals and fighters and elaborate set pieces to the surface at specific moments in the performance. The management of these underground systems during a performance was itself a logistical achievement requiring coordination between multiple teams of workers operating in the dark beneath the arena. The specific mechanisms that could lift a full-grown lion from the underground holding areas to the arena surface without the animal having any idea of what was about to happen until the gate opened and the light hit it were engineering achievements that the modern visitor to the Colosseum, looking at the exposed underground structures, can appreciate in their physical reality. The wooden floor that originally covered these structures and that has been partially reconstructed in modern restorations gives some sense of the experience of the arena as a complete working space rather than the open ruin that centuries of stone robbing and earthquake damage have produced. The seating arrangements of the Colosseum that accommodated its audience of approximately 50 to 70,000 people on the days of the games. The precise assignment of different social classes to different tiers of seating. The specific locations reserved for senators and magistrates and vestals, virgins, and various other categories of privileged viewers. the standing areas at the top of the structure that accommodated the plebeian masses. All of this was a physical representation of Roman social hierarchy that the arena space made visible and reinforced at every performance. When Commodus descended from whatever elevated position the emperor normally occupied during the games and walked into the arena floor, he was crossing the most physically dramatic social boundary in the Roman world. He was moving from the space of the most privileged viewer to the space of the least privileged performer, from the position of the person for whom the spectacle was staged to the position of the person providing it. And this crossing was visible to every one of the 50 or 70,000 people present, and was understood by all of them in terms of the specific social geography of the space. The social geography of the Roman arena was not simply an abstract cultural construction. It was a physical reality that determined where you sat and what you saw and how you experienced the performance. And Commodus's violation of this geography by entering the performance space was experienced differently depending on where you were sitting. The senators in the privileged front rows may have found it primarily outrageous, a violation of the dignity of the office they had invested in the emperor. The people in the upper tiers who were closest to the category of the performer, rather than the viewer, may have found it primarily thrilling. An emperor willing to be what they were, willing to enter the space they would enter if they had the skills. The political significance of this different reception, depending on social location, is something that the literary tradition, produced entirely by people from the senatorial end of the spectrum, systematically obscures. The voices of the people in the upper tiers are not preserved in the literary record. Their response to Commodus is inferable only through the indirect evidence of his continued popularity with the non-senatorial population and the accounts of his death that suggest genuine mourning in certain quarters. The Gladiator, who was also an emperor, died on the last night of the year and was replaced by an emperor who was not a gladiator, and the replacement, Pertinax, lasted 87 days before the Praetorian Guard killed him for trying to enforce exactly the kind of discipline and austerity that the soldiers who had profited from Commodus's generosity did not want. And the lesson that this rapid sequence taught the Roman political class was one about the difficulty of going back, about how the specific deals that Commodus had made with the soldiers and the crowd had created expectations that could not simply be rescinded by a new ruler who preferred different arrangements. The Severan dynasty that eventually stabilized the situation was itself a product of the demonstration that Commodus had given of where imperial power actually resided. Not in the Senate, not in the convention and dignity of the ancestral ways, but in the loyalty of the soldiers who would fight for you and in the enthusiasm of the crowd that would cheer for you. Septimius Severus understood this lesson with a clarity that his famous deathbed advice to his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn everyone else," encapsulates with brutal precision. The long term of Roman history after Commodus shows a progressive movement toward exactly the explicit divine kingship and explicit military basis for imperial authority that Commodus had been moving toward in his specific way. The late empire of Diocletian and Constantine made explicit what Commodus had been performing. The emperor as divine figure, the emperor as commander rather than first citizen, the court ceremonial that made the imperial person sacred and unapproachable rather than merely prominent. All of this was implicit in the Herculean Commodus of the later reign. The philosophical tradition that Marcus Aurelius represented and that Commodus rejected did not die with the rejection. It continued in the meditations that were preserved and eventually published, and that became one of the most widely read philosophical texts of the Western tradition. Marcus's vision of the philosopher-emperor who governs through self-discipline and reason rather than through divine authority and military force remained. an ideal that periodically influenced subsequent rulers and political thinkers. But it was an ideal that was in tension with the actual structure of the imperial system in ways that Commodus's reign had made unmistakably clear. The actual structure of the imperial system rewarded what Commodus offered: strength, spectacle, generosity to the soldiers, and the willingness to perform power in ways that the people who depended on that power could see and feel and respond to. The philosophical emperor who governed from principles that most of his subjects could not understand or evaluate was a more fragile political construction than the gladiatorial emperor who performed in front of 200,000 people who knew what they were looking at. This is not a defense of Commodus. It is a recognition that the specific failures of his reign were embedded in the specific structure of the system he was navigating, and that a different person in the same position, with the same biological inheritance, and the same political circumstances, and the same court culture, and the same relationship between emperor and army and crowd, might well have ended up in the same arena with the same sword. The arena is the honest place in the story of Commodus, the place where the pretenses fall away, and what remains is a man with weapons and a crowd and the specific reality of a space that does not permit abstraction. In the arena, you cannot hide behind philosophical language or institutional authority or the dignity of the office. You can only do what you can do, and the crowd decides whether it is enough. Commodus kept going back hundreds of times, which means that whatever was happening when he walked out of the tunnel and into the light was something he needed in a way that the council chamber and the audience hall and the formal court could not provide, and the specific need, the hunger for a response that was genuine rather than performed, for applause that was given because you had actually done something rather than because you were who you were, is not a mad impulse, it is a human one. The most powerful person in the world wanted to earn something, and the arena was the only place that made earning possible. That is the story of Commodus, emperor and gladiator, son of Marcus Aurelius, killer of his own people, builder of the baths that served them, performer in the space that the slaves and the condemned inhabited, divine Hercules and frightened 31-year-old dying in a bath on the last night of the year, complicated and human and worth understanding. If this story has given you something to think about, if you found yourself surprised by what you did not know about one of history's most famous but least understood emperors, leave a comment, share this video, tell someone who loves history what you learned tonight, subscribe if you have not already, because the stories waiting are as surprising as this one and as human and as worth the time. The Colosseum is standing in the dark. The stars above it are the same stars that Commodus looked up at from the arena floor. And the story that happened in that space is still happening. In every arena and every stadium and every public performance of human capability, in front of human crowds, that has happened since. The gladiator and the emperor are the same person. They were always the same person. And the crowd is always deciding. Sleep well.